So this is the Senate confirms that Dr. Erica as the CDC director, which is pretty much just bringing new leadership to a troubled agency per the AP politics side of it. So my title is today is like pretty much the Health Talk series. It's episode one, where the title is Why the CDC Leadership Matters More Than People Think. So we will do like a short read through, if we can read down um, and see that the Senate on Wednesday, which is pretty much yesterday, confirmed that Dr. Erica as the director of the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, placing her in charge of a public health agency by political meddling and low morale. She was confirmed in a uh, 51 to 44 vote, and she's a 54-year-old as she becomes the 22nd leader of the Atlanta-based CDC, which is charged with protecting Americans from preventable health threats, and the agency's first confirmed director in nearly a year. That's insane. Her resume includes medical and law degrees. Nice. A stint as a deputy surgeon general. Okay, nice. And a leadership position at the U.S. Coast Guard. That's pretty her background. Her resume is pretty nice. Her nomination appeared to be a shaky ground after the hearing before the Senate Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee last month. But one of the chairmen, which the Senator Bill Cassidy, a Republican from Louisiana, and others pretty much questioned whether she would be willing to stand up to the Republican president, Donald Trump, Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., if he ordered the CDC to do something unsupported by science and good health practice. But weeks later, Cassidy said he had spoken with her after hearing and with others who knew her and said he had gained confidence in her. So basically, if something was to happen, will she stand up for science and the good of public health practice? Wow. This is pretty interesting. Like I'm interesting to see what will happen in terms of like if some type of collision does happen, what would that look like? So, welcome to the Micro Health Signal Reset, where we will talk like about health stories in the news and just pretty much separate the signal from the noise. Today, I'm looking at the AP News article about the Senate confirmation, Dr. Erica's as the CDC director. Um, on the surface, this may sound like a political leadership story, but the bigger public health question is what makes a health agency trustworthy? And I also want to address a comment I saw that said something like, when you put a black woman in this type of position, what pandemic is on its way for a woman of color to be placed in this role? Or is this a way for brown people to have hope? To be honest, that comment made me a little frightened because I was thinking like, wow, this is a lot going on, but it opens up a real conversation about representation, tokenism, trust, race, leadership, and public health. Again, like the the phrase troubled agency in this article is where I want us to really sit for a second. It's like trouble how? Trouble because of politics, trouble because of public mistrust, trouble because of staffing issues, trouble because people don't know what to believe anymore. Is science still the science that we used to have 5, 10 years ago? What are your thoughts on that? So here's the first micro health signal reset. This is not just about who got the job, it's about whether the CDC has the structure, independence, staffing, and public credibility to do the job. So I just want to take a few points within this article and just dive deep into it. Point one is that the CDC leadership is not just symbolic. The CDC director is not just pretty much like a public face. Leadership affects what gets prioritized, what gets investigated, what gets communicated, and how fast the agency can respond. So that being like, this disease surveillance, outbreak responses, vaccine guidance, which is a big point for Robert Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the health secretary. Public health communication, a lot of misinformation, a lot of disinformation is going on. Emergency preparedness, like, are we really prepared for any type of natural disasters? Support for local and state health departments, trust during trust during like pretty much like health events. So when people say, why does the appointment matter? It matters because public health leadership becomes very visible when something goes wrong. And here is like one of the things I want to say is that we have a habit of ignoring public health until we are scared. And we ignore surveillance until there's an outbreak. We ignore staffing until systems fail. We ignore communication until misinformation fills the gap. That's what we have been feeling. We have This has been going on for some years, for a few years now. It's public health is like plumbing. People only notice it when it's backed up. But by that time, everyone notices it. Like the failure has usually been building up for a while. And I'm sure a lot of people are feeling that way. So the reset is this: public health leadership matters before emergency, not just during the emergency. Also, I want to bring another comment in that I read because I think it captures like how people are processing like this moment. It's intense, it's a lot going on, but it was what pandemic, just diving deep in like what pandemic is coming for us. It has so many layers. On one level, it reflects like suspicious. On another level, it reflects how representation can be received when institutions are already mistrusted. And so when we think about representation versus trust, representation matters, but representation alone does not repair institutional trust. And I think that's the issue. Having a woman of color in leadership can be meaningful. It can also signal possibility or hope, as one said. It can matter to communities that have historically been excluded from medical and public health leadership. But if the institution itself is under political pressure, understaffed, or not transparent, representation can start to feel symbolic instead of structural. So then, um, does her identity matters? It does. But I think there is a bigger question here. She have the authority, the independence. Will she have the authority, independence, and support to lead based on science and based on the good public health practices? That is the overall question. And so representation is very important, but representation is not the same as institutional repair. So this is where where it's pretty much uncomfortable, and sometimes institutions place people of color, women, or other historically excluded leaders in high pressure roles during moments of crises. And when that happens, people start to really just ask questions like, is this real empowerment or is this crisis management with a diverse face? But we also have to be careful. We should not automatically just assume, that a woman of color is in this specific leadership position is only there to be like a symbol. That can erase her qualifications, and we pretty much read her qualifications, which are pretty nice. And it can reduce her identity alone. So we don't want to be that unfair. We want to be fair and ask, a fair question is not why her. The question is like, what power, protection, and independence does she actually have in this role? And so we need to just stop doing this thing where leaders of color are either turned into saviors or scapegoats. Like if things go well, people say, "See, representation fixed it." If things go badly, people say, "See, she was not qualified." Both are just lazy analysis. Like leadership has to be judged by decisions, transparency, evidence, accountability, and the conditions around the person, not just by the identity alone. So we have to take those into consideration, I think. Identity can shape public perception, but systems shape public health outcomes. And I think that's the bigger picture here. Trust is not just a feeling, trust is not built by saying, "Trust us." Trust is built by showing your work. So if you think about it, people can handle complicated information. What people do not handle well is feeling like information is being managed, hidden, spun, or politicized. Another reflection is that public mistrust does not come from nowhere. Some of it comes from like misinformation. Yes, like, but some of it comes from real historical and present day failures, which I think misinformation, real historical and present day failures. Once you see failures, whether it's historical or present day, it's better to look at and identify those failures and to look at like medical racism, inconsistent messaging, lack of access, political interference, institutions speaking at communities instead of with them. So if the CDC wants trust, especially from certain communities, it cannot just put a specific face in a leadership and call that trust building. Trust requires relationships, transparency, accountability, and community engagement. Um, Mistrust is not always ignorance. Sometimes mistrust is memory. Public health exists inside the government. So politics will always be nearby. Budgets are political, appointments are political, laws are political, but the scientific process has to be protected. The danger is when evidence becomes secondary to ideology. So public health can survive disagreement. It cannot survive if people believe the evidence is being bent to fit a political outcome, though. So we also need to stop pretending that public health decisions affect everyone equally because they don't. Okay, like pretty much they don't. When public health systems are weakened, the first people harmed are usually people with the least protection. Low income communities, disabled people, elderlies, rural communities, Black and brown communities, immigrant communities, and people without easy access to care. So the CDC leadership is not just some abstract, like it affects real people, especially during outbreaks, disasters, vaccine debates, and health emergencies, which I think there needs to be more conversation surrounding vaccination because if people 30 years ago received vaccination 30 plus years ago and they are still surviving, what is actually going on? What does the science tell us? What is the science telling us? What is the data telling us? And I think we need to identify those things a little bit more before you get to those vaccination debates and to understand that more. Because one person alone doesn't determine um, real information for vaccination education or 10 people alone. The world is super huge and the United States is big as well. So I think numbers matter and you need to have more information on it to make a scientifically sound debate. So I do have like a few questions that if anyone wants to chime in. when you hear that this specific woman is now leading the CDC, like, does this make you feel more hopeful, more skeptical, or does it depend on what power she actually has? I think sometimes we also place, and it's just me personally thinking and reading a lot about things that's going on, we think that once we see somebody that looks similar to us and put them in a certain high level position, that it gives us hope, thinking that those people in a position will be able to do more for the people who look like them. And that's not always the case. And I think President Obama was one of the people who was basically criticized because he had brown skin and he should have did this and he should have did that. When in reality, we have to look at the politics behind it. And I think sometimes, most of the times, we don't look at it in that sense. We think, oh, because this person is brown, they will do this, this, and this for us. Yeah, it's so much that they can really do for us without the politics that stands in the back of them. Okay. So, question two is, what makes you trust a health recommendation? Is it the source? Is it the data, or the person delivering it, or your lived experience? I want to say, for me, I think it's always the data, because the data tells the story. The data tells the story that the source can't provide validation for sometimes. So the person delivering it is not what makes me trust health recommendation. Or sometimes, if you can back it up through data that you've had this specific lived experience, then I can see the data and a lived experience will make more sense to me than the person delivering it and the source. Because if the source is not a credible source, credible meaning backed up with statistics, that requires numbers, and analyzing those numbers through somebody who has experienced a certain thing, then I can't see if it's a trusted health recommendation. I would have to see the numbers, and you can't have an insignificant number or insignificant value that doesn't align with the true value, or what's considered the gold standard. So question three would be, can representation rebuild trust if the institution itself has not changed? This one is a heavy question, because um, I think representation can, at a small percent, can start to create steps at rebuilding trust. Um, while holding the institution fully responsible for providing the necessary tools needed to build an institution. So I think it's a really heavy question. But okay, um, if you want to chime in on those three questions, your thoughts, feedback, or anything of that nature is very much appreciated. So my final micro health signal reset is that, when we think about leadership in general, or specifically this story, the CDC leadership matters because public health depends on more than just having facts. It depends on whether people believe those facts are being gathered, interpreted, and communicated through a trustworthy process. So representation does matter, but it cannot be used as like a shortcut for trust. A woman of color leading the CDC, like, it is historic, it's meaningful, and it's important. We appreciate that. But the real test is whether she has the independence, the authority, the transparency, and the institutional support to protect and serve the public health, the science, and just ensuring that the better outcomes for public health practices are being utilized. I think is very important. So don't just watch the headline, watch the systems behind the headline. So again, it's your host. It's your host, Naja, here at Micro Health Signal Reset. This is the Health Talk, the first episode, and that's the signal. Representation can open the door, but systems determine whether public health actually changes. So I'm checking out. I hope that you've enjoyed this good health talk, and we'll talk soon. Have a good day.